Climate change has the potential to reverse the hard-earned developmental gains of the past decades and impede the progress towards achieving the Millennium Development Goals. With this in mind, what responses can African government policymakers offer to mitigate the impacts of climate change? Hello and welcome to Climate Change Perspectives. I'm Eleni Jokas, and joining me in studio, my guest host Daniel Kinnear, Senior Executive Associate at the Africa Strategy Group. And this week we take a look at the economic impact of climate change and, of course, climate overall on the African continent. Here to share their views with us are Caroline Kende-Robb, Executive Director for the Africa Progress Panel. And then joining us, of course, from Geneva via Skype and in studio, I have South African Minister Trevor Manuel, Minister in the Presidency for the National Planning Commission, and Peter Draper, Senior Research Fellow, Economic Program, Diplomacy Program at the South African Institute of International Affairs. On that note, I welcome you to the show. Thank you so very much for joining us. Minister, let's start off with you. We've got unemployment in South Africa sitting at 25%. We have poverty, and we have a very big issue when it comes to financing anything to do with climate change and, of course, becoming a greener economy. We have a massive reliance on coal, which we know is devastating to the overall environment. Can we balance all of these issues out?
I don't think we have a choice about balancing, Eleni. But I think that it's important to take a Pan-African view on these issues. And we're seeing the ravages. And, you know, over a number of years, these issues have been spoken of. The Commission for Africa report dealt with the need to get agriculture up and running, to spend wisely on education, on healthcare and so on, so that the Millennium Development Goals could be met. That was confirmed by the Glen Eagles heads of state meeting. There was a very strong commitment to very significant increases in official development assistance. It hasn't flowed. Other work done within the UN when Kofi Annan was still Secretary General. On the panel, Jeffrey Sachs did a lot of the technical work. The story was written. I don't think that we need to convince each other of the needs that exist across the continent. But we haven't seen financial flows to support what everybody agrees needs to be done. And that's a big issue. When I speak to policymakers on the continent, and I was privileged to hear Minister Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, who's now back as the finance minister in Nigeria, explain that previously climate change, development generally, including poverty relief, and agriculture used to sit in 3 different ministries. It now is exactly the same issue. It needs to be dealt with in one place. All of government must respond, and this is the issue of the African continent. And within all of this, South Africa is in a relatively privileged position, but we will need some resources from the outside. But I think we have to be in the queue with the rest of Africa and be able to develop and balance needs.
But Peter, is that your view from the experience on policy and on developmental issues, what the minister describes of all the initiatives, over several years, the policies are in place, the programs are in place, the deficit is the question of resource. I mean, do we really see that impact as a result been sort of exasperated because of climate change?
You're talking about the African context?
Yes,
shortage of
the
resources?
African context.
Yeah, look, certainly I think that is the case on the continent. And the challenge, the fundamental challenge that the continent faces is really one of adaptation, by the way, and we should distinguish between the adaptation challenge and the mitigation challenge. So the mitigation challenge really is the industrialized countries and the big emerging players such as South Africa, which I would suggest does face a mitigation challenge. But for most of the rest of the continent, or certainly the subcontinent, the challenge is adaptation, and their finance is a key constraint. But I'm not optimistic that in this current global environment we're going to see those kinds of resources flow on a sustainable basis. I just got back from Germany, and the discussion there is very different in Europe. It's all about saving Greece, potentially Italy, who knows, maybe even French banks. So where's the money going to come from? That's really the question.
Caroline, over to you. Given the fact that, of course, we have seen a lot of financial issues hit the global economy, and we know we're still recovering from the 2008 financial crisis. As both the Minister and Peter alluded to, we haven't seen the flows coming through yet. Do you think that we have actually seen economies being convinced about the devastating effects of climate change? Because if people were really convinced, then surely they'd be acting.
I think there's different stakeholders involved, and I was in Paris last week at the G20 on development, and what President Sarkozy said there is that this is a unique time for doing things differently. And what we're picking up, especially with regards to Africa, is an understanding that everybody is now interdependent on each other, and Africa now really is, part of the solution for Europe even. It's no longer about charity, it's no longer about handouts. So the financing, everybody's questioning the financing, everybody's questioning aid, everybody's questioning everything with the global crisis, with, problems in the States, the Eurozone, Arab Spring. There's lots of these different factors that are impacting upon our traditional understanding of development in the past. And I definitely agree that it's about getting the financing right. And it's definitely not about cutting aid, and I think there needs to be a strong message that we still need aid. But there's other forms of financing, as Bill Gates' report is highlighting, whether it's contributions from a financial transaction tax or enabling a maritime or a bunker fuel tax, or to contribute towards a different picture of what financing for development looks like. And I think that's what we're grappling with at the moment, a massively changing world, the geopolitics changing, the financing for development changing. But what African policymakers have said to us recently, especially those sitting in finance, is whatever we get, it has to be less complex, it has to be predictable, and it has to be untied. And so there's some very clear messages coming through about development finance.
Minister, you've just recently delivered, after many months of hard work with some of your colleagues, international colleagues of Mexico and Norway, a paper on the Green Fund. Does it offer some of the answers that Africa is looking for and the international community is looking for?
It's very important to see this in context. In Copenhagen at the end of 2009, heads of state agreed to finance climate change. And very importantly, as Peter said, the financing of adaptation is the core of all of that. Last year, the UN Secretary General appointed a panel to explore where this resource would come from. I served in that panel, and we demonstrated almost exactly a year ago in a report that it was feasible but challenging. $100 billion a year by 2020 can be done. Now, that number was arrived at without even the financial transactions tax that Caroline just spoke of. But in a more recent report done for the Gates Foundation that will be tabled in Cannes, the idea of a financial transactions tax, a minuscule tax on financial transactions, can raise $50 billion a year. The key question is whether it will be transferred into a fund to deal with the ravages of climate change. Now, going to Cancun last year, the language picks up on Copenhagen, and it says that a substantial part of the $100 billion a year should transit through the Green Climate Fund. We've now produced the report. It was adopted, though not unanimously, and the report will now go to COP17. And the report is for the design of the fund that will be made up of, or led by a board comprising 24 members, 12 from developing countries and 12 from the developed world. And they will have to manage this fund. The problem is that some of the decisions, important as they are deficient as well. Because in Copenhagen they spoke of fast start finance, 30 billion up to 2013, and then 100 billion a year by 2020. And the ramp up from, call it 10 billion a year to 100 billion a year was not spelt out. Now that is detail that was not in the mandate from the Copenhagen Accord, but work will have to be done to ensure that the ramp up is there. We can't afford to waste time. I go back and I start from the premise that heads of state who gathered in Copenhagen agree that there's a fundamental problem. The problem is one that's about the ravages of increasing temperatures, erratic rainfall, and it's the adaptation challenge in poor countries. That is why the language of both Copenhagen and Cancun is about a transfer of resources from the developed to the developing world. So we've got the architecture in place. Now it's about getting the funds to flow, and I think that's a challenge before us.
Lenny, I was thinking, when the Minister refers to the architecture, I mean, some would argue, Minister, that, and I think there's strong proponents that oppose it, maybe you can offer us a perspective on this, Peter, is let's go through the World Bank, let's go through an existing institution. Who are the boards? What voting rights? How are we going to look at disbursement? Does that, can we move this good work that has been done into a space where we can get early action?
Well, I'll just offer one observation, but I'd personally love to hear the Minister answer that question as well. When I looked at this question about 2 years ago, there was something like 45 different climate funds or funds dealing with climate issues. The World Bank is one of them, it's got several pots of money, but there's a range of others. So it really is quite a complicated institutional picture, and I guess the UN is part of that story, but it's by no means the only part of the story.
So you're leading to more of a coordinated move towards one big climate
Can
fund.
it be coordinated, I wonder?
Well,
Minister.
I think there are two parts to it. The one is you need better coordination across the climate investment funds. I don't think that there's any dispute about that. Got to sort out the rules of procedure, got to sort out the applicability of any of those funds. That's one part of it. The other part of it, and I think it's very important not to second guess heads of state when they agreed to the $100 billion a year. There's a preceding phrase in the document. It's new and additional. So over and above the management of the climate investment funds, they agreed on new and additional resources of $100 billion a year, and that I think is very important in the context. But who will manage it, and whether the board of this fund will be able to manage $100 billion a year, I think the jury is still out on. On the one hand, the way in which we've crafted the document is for a learning organization that will grow and adapt as it goes forward. But on the other hand, I think it's important to recognize as well that the World Bank, with all of its systems, disperses about $40 billion a year.
Yeah, exactly.
So $100 billion is a large number. But we've got to get the balance right, and I think we've got to push the boundaries to ensure that we can actually take forward the letter and spirit of Copenhagen and Cancun, and Durban offers us a platform to do that.
On that note, we're going to a very short break. More when we come back. Stay tuned.